Yeah. Just move it closer. And I think we can get started. Can you sit down for a second? Yeah. Unfortunately, we find ourselves once again a year later having been forced to confront and meet, encounter Hashem, but in a different way than we would like. Tisha Beav is called a moyed. We usually think of moyadim as happy occasions. We had the Oyhel Moyed, we had a place where we could encounter Hashem, where we would see and experience Nissim. Today is a different type of encounter. It's also a Moyed, which is why we don't say Tachanun, more of that later. But it's the Moyed that we hoped we wouldn't have to have this year. But unfortunately, we find ourselves here again. In the kinnos of Daled, Rebbe Elazar HaKaler writes, Al Churban Beis HaMikdash, Esak B'chol Shana V'Shana, Mispeid Chodosh. For the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, I will create every single year a Mispeid Chodosh, a new Mispeid. It's not enough, it seems, just to rehash, to think again like we did last year and the year before. Because if we really appreciated and understood what Churban is, what Shekhinah is, and what we are missing, we would realize a fresh year, a fresh dimension. And I think perhaps we can add, we know that Chazal tell us that the root and the source, the Makoyer, the Shoresh of all sorrows, of every bad thing, every bit of pain and tears and tragedy and loss in the world is directly connected to the fact that we don't have Shekhinah, we don't have a connection to Hashem as we should have, as was manifest through the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, our chiyuv this year is to identify and are continuing to happen, which bring fresh pain. Our brothers and sisters throughout the world, and realize and recognize and cry for them and with them today. Who would have thought, last year we thought it was bad enough. A Mageifa, a plague that ripped apart families and communities. So many died in their prime, young and old. So many families without parents, grandparents were taken away at a young age. We thought, surely it can't be any worse. Beginning, hopefully, who knows, to come through one part of it at least. And we hope and we daven that it doesn't come back with a particularly virulent strain that claims the lives of more. We don't know. But we thought that's it. What else can go wrong this year? And then in the midst of so-called almost civilized Europe, not some civil war in deepest, darkest Africa, a continent that we can't always relate to, and we kind of half expect every now and again different people from different cultures will set upon each other and things won't be great, but that one of the big powers in Europe would blatantly, without any shame, without just launch an attack on a neighbor and in the process kill and displace hundreds of thousands. So this year we cry also for those whose lives from one minute to the next, safe and secure in Kiev, in Odessa, in places where there've been Yidden for many, many centuries. It was never plain sailing there, we know that. But literally overnight, uprooted, and who knows where this is going to end. Who would have thought that in 2022, the finance minister of one of the largest economies in the world would talk about having cold showers because there isn't enough gas? Who would have thought such a thing is even possible? The Rebbeinu Shalom is shaking the world, telling you don't be complacent, nothing, don't take anything for granted. You can't rely on anything. And all of this, all of this is linked in some way to destruction, to fragmentation, to a disconnect of people within themselves, between others, and in a connection to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And therefore, we will try as much as we can to carry out the tzivui of Rebbe Elazar Kalir, Chol Shana v'Shana, with Mispeit Chodosh. This year, as we know, today is actually the 10th of Av. And the Tanis, by rights, ought to have been yesterday, but not, of course, on Shabbos. And the Chasam Sofer asks a simple but profound question. Why don't we say Tachanun today? Today is not Tisha Beav. Today is not the Moyed, surely. That date is very precise. There was a discussion as to whether it should be 10th or the 9th, but it was very precisely the 10th. The 9th rather, Tisha Beav. So why don't we say Tachanun today? Surely the only thing that was pushed off, asks the Chasam Sofer, was the fasting aspect. You can't fast on a Shabbos. But the Moyed surely was yesterday. And the Chasam Sofer, as he so often does, and he's so radical and mechudesh, innovative, he says that's why the Pasuk says, Soim hachamishi yihi l'sasoin l'simcha. When the Novi says, and as was pointed out to me, it's not just a nevuah, it's a psak halacha. The day will come when the Tzayim HaRavi and the Tzayim HaChamishi and the Tzayim HaAsiri will be l'sosoinu l'simcha. Notice he doesn't say the 9th of the 5th month. He says Tzayim HaChamishi, the Tzayim of the Chamishi, the day upon which we fasted in the Chamishi. And therefore he says something incredible, which should set us on our path today as we begin the avodah of the day. He says it's not the day that causes the moyed and the encounter. It's not a fixed date in which we encounter Hashem. It's the other way round. It is when Jews are tzom, when we sit on the floor and cry, and when we fast, and when we feel the absence and the lack of Hashem in our lives, that's when it becomes the moyed. That fixes the moyed. Obviously, we're not going to do it in the middle of Shvat. We're not going to do it in the middle of nowhere. But if for a practical reason we have to push it off for one day, then today is the time, today is the moyed, today is the day of encounter. And it is this day, it is our avodah today, it is our crying today that creates this moyed, this encounter, and that's why there is no tachnun. And then he goes further and he's mechadash something astounding as only the Chassid Sofer can. And he says, L'osid lovai, k'sheyiboneh hamikdash. He says in Yitz Hashem in years to come, when we have the Beis HaMikdash. And in those days, the 9th of Av will fall once again on Shabbos. Which day will be the Yom Tov? Which day will be the Yom Tov of Tisha Beav? Will it be really the 9th of Av, which may occasionally coincide with Shabbos? Or will it be the Sunday, the 10th? And these she says that the moyed, if we did in this encounter with Hashem on the basis of our avodah, and that is what makes this day special, then it is that day which, even when we have the Beis HaMikdash, that day will be the day of the Simcha. So by way of introduction, that is to set the scene, to set the tone. It's not as if there is something in the day already and we somehow just need to tap into it, especially today, which is the 10th. We need, through our avodah, to create this encounter with Hashem. Let's take an insight. Let's take a few moments to understand the nature of the day. Will be slightly halachic, but only to really set the scene and to understand what is really going on, because it is an unusual form of Avenos. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Tanis, when he talks about how one mourns for the Beis HaMikdash, he says, Chasidim harishonim kach hoisom midasa. There are limitations for the average Jew, how they should mourn for the Beis HaMikdash. But then he says the following. He says, Chasidim harishonim, the early, pious, holy Jews, this is what they used to do, and it's based on the Gemara. Erev Tisha Beav hayu meviin leila adam paschareva b'melach. Erev Tisha Beav, they would bring to somebody who would be sitting on the floor dry bread dipped in salt. The Yoshev ben Tanor v'kirayim v'oichlon, he would sit in the most uncomfortable place in the house between the stove, the oven, v'shoisa alein kiton shel mayim, and he would drink water with it, b'daga u'b'shimomoin, with anxiety, u'b'chia, and crying, kemi shemesoi mutar lefanov, as if there was a mesoi, a loved one laid out before him, a dead relative in front of him. Mesoi mutal lefonov. And here the Rambam is saying something unusual, because usually when it comes to Avelus, the Rambam, a regular Avelus, when somebody chas v'shalom loses a loved one, the Rambam actually takes the opposite view. And he says, there is such a thing as being too upset. He says, of course, Chazal fixed the different levels, the different stages of grief, 3 days for crying, and then Shiva, and then Shloshim. And as upsetting as it is, but Zehu min Hogoy Shel Olam, this is the way of the world. We are born, we live, and we die, and everybody knows that. And even though when it happens, it's upsetting, of course, and one has to give expression to that grief, but not too much. The Rambam uses very strong words. Somebody who goes over this border is not smart, shall we say. However, it seems that that is only true for Avelus, regular Avelus. But Avelus for the Churban Abayis, the minhag of Hasidim or Rishonim, in other words, something that is praiseworthy, is to be mitztaer yoser midai, is to do the opposite, is to be overcome and stricken with grief. And the reason is simple. The clue is in how the Rambam explains regular Avelus, because regular Avelus, even though one knows it's going to happen at some point, and even though, of course, when it happens, there's always an element of shock and disbelief, but it is at the end of the day, min hogoy shel olam. This is the way of the world. But the Churban was different. The Churban was not min hogoy shel olam. This wasn't something that should have happened, that we should have expected, we should have anticipated. But rather, we sinned and we kicked our father out of his own house, the house that he wanted to use as a way of showing his love for us. We gave him no choice. We kicked him out. And therefore, there is no limit. There's no shiur for this Avelus. And here something else becomes apparent. Nowhere in Hilchas Avelus does it say that there is a mitzvah to cry. Now, simply speaking, because usually a normal reaction to a tragedy and a loss, it's natural. You don't need, like there's no mitzvah to breathe, there's no mitzvah to cry for somebody that passes away. Indeed, if anything, it's when Chazal say that 3 days for crying, it's a limitation. There is an expectation to cry, but the 3 days are set aside. That is a limit. That is a limit, rather. However, we discover today, in the avodah that we have today, something we discover the exact opposite. There is an emphasis on crying. And that is the avodah of the day. Notice, no tshuva, no vidui, even though generally ta'anesim are very much about teshuvah. There is no slichos. There's no vidui, which you would expect. Because today perhaps is not even a day of tefillah. Sosam tefillasi. We read that last night. Sakoisa ba'onon loch me avor tefillah. There is a cloud that separates between us. Hashem says, I don't want to hear your tefillos anymore. Based tefillah, I don't want that. There is only one thing, there is only one mitzvah this morning, today, one halacha, and that is to cry. There's nothing else. That's the only expression that we find. The whole of Megillas Eicha and the kinnos, they're just full of expressions of crying. That is the Avelos for the Churban. When they posed the question during the days of Bayis Sheni, whether to still fast for Tisha Beav, for the first Bayis, how was the question posed? The Pasuk in Zechariah says, should we still cry in the fifth month? That is the question. They didn't ask, should we fast? The question was one question only. The avodah of the day, is it still relevant in Bayis Sheni? Because we have a Beis HaMikdash. Should I cry? Because of course, we trace the roots of the tragedies, all the tragedies and the destructions. And so many of them coincided with Tisha Beav, as we know, world wars, expulsion from Spain, so many other things. Because what happened was, all those years ago, the Meraglim come back on this day and they give their report and they say their Lashon Hara, and they don't believe, they don't trust that Hashem will take them into the land. Vatiso kol ha'eda vayitnu es kolam vayivku ha'om balaylo hahu. How did we respond? We cried. We cried. Those were tears of despair. We're stuck here in the Midbar. We're never going to get out here. Hashem took us out from Egypt just to kill us here in the Midbar. And we didn't shout, we didn't scream, we didn't write petitions, or we didn't go on Twitter. We just gave expression, our deepest form of expression, which is beyond and above words. It was we just cried. Let's say Chazal, as we all know, you cried for nothing. Lefonai, in front of me, in my presence, in the midbar, you're in my face. I'm in your face. You know, you get mon every day. You don't need to change or buy new clothes. You don't go to the bathroom. You know this. You are lefonai. You know I exist. You know I love you and I care for you. And you're still able to cry tears of despair and hopelessness. And more than that, the Hasidic Sfarim explain, you've taken one of the, if not the deepest way of connecting to the Rabbeinu Shalom, even when Sharei Tefillah, as the Gemara tells us, even when the gates of prayer are closed, such as today, Sosam Tfilosi, when there is a Chomas Barazel, there is an iron curtain between us and Hashem when it comes to Tefillah. Garam Kisirbu Tefillah Ineni Shoimeya. We read in the Haftarah yesterday, even if you will daven along Shmeina Esra, I'm not interested in Hashem, I'm not listening. Even when that avenue of Tefillah is not available, for the Shaharei D'mois Loidinalu, the gates of tears are never closed. With one condition, of course, as the Kotzker Rebbe said famously, If the gates of tears are never closed, what is the point of having a gate? And as he answers famously, to keep out the false tears, to keep out, in English we call them the crocodile tears. Something as precious as tears. HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts them, as we say in our slichas, b'noidcha lihiyos, and therefore they cannot be abused. They can't be superficial. They have to be real. And that is the avodah that faces us this morning. How are we going to somehow manage to squeeze out a few genuine tears? That's the avodah. That's the purpose of it all. With the normal Avelis, we don't find kinnos, we find hesped, we find eulogy. But with the Avelis of Tisha Beav, we have kiru lebekoinanois v'tivkeno v'teiradno eineinu dima. The purpose is to be able, like I said, to squeeze out some genuine tears. Hesped is about giving kavod and remembering a person or a thing that was. Kinnos is crying for the sake of crying. With a normal avelos, there are limitations. With the churban abayis, any dire, say Chazal, any generation in which the Beis Hamikdash is not rebuilt, we can't just turn around and point the finger of blame at our forefathers. Because if it isn't rebuilt in our day, it means that in some way, in our level, in our lives, we're keeping the same mistakes going. I saw an interpretation of the famous Chazal, which I hadn't realized before. When it says about Rochel, Mevakal Boneho, Rochel cries, more of that later. And as we know, it is Rochel's tears that are the lubricant, the liquid that brings the Mashiach. It doesn't say she cries. It says Mevakal. Mevakal means she's encouraging us to cry. Grammatically, it means she is Mevakal al Boneho. She calls to us today and she says, Kinderlech, cry. Me'anolihi nochem. And with this, we find another difference. And that is when we are discussing or talking about a private loss, the loss of an individual. There, the halacha is very clear. The best way to accept that, we do tziduk hadin. We keep quiet. We say, Rabbeinu Shloim, I don't understand why you've done this, why this person had to pass away now. He was young, she was young. Why did they have to have this illness? What was the cheshbon? But the avodah there is tziduk hadin, is to say, Hashem, you know better, and we just have to be quiet and accept it as best as we can. And daven yiskadal v'yiskadash me'rabbo. As the Mishnah says, we have a chiyuv levarech al hora'ah, to say Baruch Dayan ha'emes, in the same way that we make a bracha for the good. When it comes to the churban, avelos for the churban, If you think about the whole style of Gillas Eicha, it's questions. Eicha, how is it possible? How could this be? Questioning mainly ourselves. We're also questioning the Rabbeinu Shalom. We're asking a question. The Avelos that affects all of us. We turn to the Rabbeinu Shalom and we say, Eicha, how could this be? Says that when Moshe Rabbeinu, the first time he was sent to Parai and failed spectacularly, and he goes back to Hashem and says, how could you do this? Me'oz basi al Parai ledaber bishmecha heiro la'om hazeh v'hatzei lehitzalto esamecha. Says the Medrash, ba'isa shah biksha midas hadin lifgoya b'Moshe. At that moment in time, the Midas Hadin wanted to come and strike down Moshe. Kiven shero HaKadosh Baruch Hu shebishvil Yisrael u'omer lo yipoga b'Midas Hadin. Hashem said, leave him be. He's not asking for himself personally. He's only asking because he cares for Klal Yisrael. If this question would be posed in any other context and for any other Klal Yisrael, perhaps it would be. But in this context, he's only doing it because he cares. Ulefi shehistakel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Medrash, because Hashem saw shebishvil tzar Yisrael hu diber kain, that he spoke only out of pain because he cares for Klal Yisrael. Chozav nohag by midas harachamim. Hashem changed his approach and he used midas harachamim. Vayomer Elov ani Hashem. So this is to set the scene a little bit. I want to read out a few lines from the Mesilas Yesharim in Perek Yud Tes. And he asks a question on behalf of us all, a question that we probably all ask ourselves at some point. He's talking about the obligation to daven for Shekhinah, to feel the loss of the connection to Hashem. And he asks as follows. Maybe just to introduce it very briefly, to say this Chodesh is called Menachem Av. Never forget, as much as we are focused on our tzoros, and even the tzoros of our brothers and sisters, even if it's not our own personal tzoros, but today, in many respects, if not primarily, it's actually about, it's stopping to think about the Rebbeinu Shalom. How must he feel? The story is told of the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, and he was in Krakow. He was, as we know, a tremendous guy, a tremendous genius, publishing his Sfarim, Al HaTorah, on the tour, but he encountered lots of difficulties in the practical aspects, whether it was funding or getting a printer, and he just sensed it wasn't going, it wasn't working, and he was very upset, he was very bothered. He wanted to publish his Torah. He had Torah for the world and he wants to publish it. And one night, so the story goes, he was sitting and he was very upset about all the impediments, all the obstacles that he was coming across, preventing him, stopping him from publishing his Svarim. And then he had an insight. he thought to himself, think about what you're doing. You have something that you want to publish, you have Torah you want to publish. You're thinking about yourself. It just hit him. How must the Ribbono Shel Olam be feeling? He has Torah that he wants to publish. He has children that he wants to connect with every single day, and he is prevented from doing so. Why are you focusing, he asked himself, on your own personal tsar? Why don't you focus and think for a minute about the tsar of the Shekhinah? He said he was overcome by this, and he sat on the floor, and for the first time, it seems, in a long time, he sat, and he said, Tikkun Chatzos, and he cried bitterly for the tsar HaShekhinah, the pain that Hashem is feeling. He said he davened so hard, he cried so much, he fell asleep. And in the dream, somebody had dreamed that what you have done just now has released. You were right. There was a blockage, and it was you. The Torah, your Torah does deserve to have a place in the world, but you were very focused on yourself, and in Shamayim, in heaven, they felt that a tzaddik as great as you should be also focused on the tsar of the Shekhinah, and you weren't doing that. And finally, you've come to this realization, and from that moment on, he said everything went easy, and he managed to publish his Sfarim, so many of which we have, and we learn today. This Chodesh is called Menachem Av. It's actually mainly about thinking, stopping and thinking for a moment what it must be like to be anybody who is a parent will know that there can be no greater hurtful thing than something we actually read yesterday. We read yesterday, I don't know if you passed over it. To me, this is perhaps the most painful few words in the Torah. In the aftermath of the Meraglim, we turned round to Hashem and we said, Besinas Hashem oisonu hoitzionu me'eretz Mitzrayim. Because Hashem hates us, he took us out of Mitzrayim, and now we're going to die in the Midbar. This is the first, I think, this has to be the first sinas chinam, the first absolutely baseless, no base in reality at all. And we turn, what's the most, and these words are now recorded, Lonetzach. Every year we have to read these words. It's now part of Torah. Can there be more painful, more hurtful words than a child who says to his parent and means it, Besinas, you hate me. There can't be anything more painful. The sinas Hashem oisonu. We deluded ourselves. We became so crazy. We cried that night tears of hopelessness and despair, and we felt that Hashem hated us. Besides for how tragic that is for us and for a child, but think for a moment what that means to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, ask the Mesilas Yesharim, a person needs to think about this. It's right at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes we forget to read it. Ro'oi l'chol yirei shamayim sheyehi meitzar v'doyeg ala churban. The Ramah says, anybody who claims to have any yiras shamayim at all should be pained by the churban. Ve'im yoymar, and he quotes, says the Mesilas Yesharim, he quotes a Tana Dvei Eliyahu, a medrash, and he says that a person should be misaveh umeitzar lechvoid Yerushalayim ulechvoid Beis Hamikdash. We should care about the kovod of Yerushalayim and the kovod of the Beis Hamikdash. V'yispalel tomid al geulason shel Yisrael. We should constantly daven for the geula of Klal Yisrael. V'hashovas kvod shamayim, and the restoration, the returning of the glory, the kovod of Shamayim. V'im yomar odom. And if a person should say, Mi ani umo ani sofn she'espalel al hagolus va'al Yerushalayim. Who am I? I'm not a great Talmud Chacham. I'm not a big tzaddik. I'm a regular guy. I get up in the morning. I come to shul. I daven. I try and learn a bit now and again. I'm a simple, the so-called Poshet Yid. The Mesilas Yesharim is talking to every single one of us and says that should we say, Mi ani umo ani, who am I? What right do I have? What right do I have? She'espalel al hagolus v'al Yerushalayim. Hamipnei tfilosi yikonsu hagoluyos v'titzmach hayeshua. And do I really think, am I arrogant enough to think that because of my tefillah, Hashem will bring Mashiach? Teshuvasoi b'tzidoi, what is the response? What is the answer? He quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Lefichach nivra Adam Yechidi, man is created alone. Everybody is born alone and leaves the world alone. Kedei shekol echad yomar b'shvili nivra ha'olam, so that everybody should genuinely say, the world was created for me. Ukvar nachas ruach ulefonov yizbarach, sheyubonov mevakshim u'mispalalim al zois. Here I have to explain, there are two questions that the Mesilas Yesharim is asking. The first question is, who am I? I don't matter, I don't count. That is the first question. Surely my tefillah is irrelevant. Question number two, even if I might be somebody, do I really think my tefillahs are going to have the required effect? Am I going to bring the Mashiach? And therefore he gives two answers. The first point he said is, who are you? You are an individual, and you need to know every single individual, every single Jew is an olam mole, is an entire world. And I think maybe just very briefly to add, especially when we are talking about tragedy, we sometimes get caught up and we throw around numbers, and sometimes they're not helpful. 6 million. 6 million. Who can even envisage being in a town square, being in a space with 6 million people? It frankly is beyond my, I can't visualize that. I can't relate to that. And that is actually a problem. I know it's massive, millions, so many Yidden, but that actually also has a problem because I disconnect from it then. It's too much. I can't deal with it, which is one of the reasons why we will, a little bit later, we'll talk about the stories of some individuals in the Holocaust. You have to make it personal. And that's maybe the reason why one of the kinnos, a very beautiful kinno that we'll say later perhaps, is the one of the two children, the brother and sister of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanani of the Kohen Gadol. They were beautiful and they were being forced by their Roman captor to marry each other, and instead they died instead. Just taking, that makes it real when you bring it down to the level of being personal. And that's the first thing the Mesilas Yesharim is answering. He's saying, who are you? Maybe this is the problem. The problem is that we've forgotten who we are. The Eicha, the first Eicha is of course Ayeka. It's the hesped that Hashem gives on man himself. Hashem delivers the first kinnos, says the Medrash. Same letters. Ayeka, where are you? Where have you gone? You, the one individual in the world that I thought you were going to do right, you're gone. Ayeka, Eicha. So that's the first point. And then the second point is, even if Hashem doesn't bring back the Beis Hamikdash because of your tefillah, but it gives him nachas ruach. Ukvar nachas ruach lefonov yizborach. Think about how Hashem feels that you care, that you daven, even if you don't manage. But you care, and you've shown that you care. We've done what we can in Eimheim Osu Es Shelahem v'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Sameach, and that makes Hashem happy. I think that's probably enough of an introduction for the moment. There's so plenty more to be said. Let's say together. Let's start the first kinnos. It's actually kinnos Vav, and it actually takes one word. And that word is shovas. It's a word that comes towards the end of Megillas Eicha. And the theme, the idea is that until the very last minute, we thought it wasn't going to happen. There wasn't going to be a Churban Abayis. And then when it happened, everything went silent. And when at moments of great tragedy, at moments of great loss, sometimes the shock is so great, everybody just stops, everything stops. Let's say the first one together. Shova surumeni shimuni oibrai, schiumoi sesimuni bedrei chaveirai, sakoi so mishkan, mischois devirai, sakoi so v'hubukukim boirai, Sof kuchaf umoadu evorai kesilo kol abirai. Noflo ideinu betzud chuyo. Eidi chiksol achazoin ben berechyo. Ad pilei gilgol chavuyo. Eidi moile les pilon nisnechuyo. Oso v'nicham v'yipro lavidim chiyo. V'no malele ani boichio. Al pnei frost nufzu chasideho. Al geisuv zachro ki yodu yisoideho. Achat chenshi loy tochaf soideho. Potzu chazi v'yar ayei chasideho. Potzu maseyer yolunideho. Persot ziyoit b'yodeho. Al haratzioi tzadu shiachnei medonai Tzofu al roshei tziyoin zedoinai Tzomsu benoi vlamoin zedoinai Tzoiden notzar toloi medonai Zoakami bimei vendinai Tzadiku adoinoi Atokali michmadu tomedi yermuni Hirav tobo yelai vayacharimuni. Karos yoish v'givonedheim zermuni. Toili lashmiya ba'arov v'knimuni. Umi avoyri v'osei lerimuni. Karosi lema ahavai heim morimuni. Lo moru achapeinu latevach shomoru. Ro'isa ki chesanu ro'im chomoru. Lo Yisachiyom Bachas Bimuyoch Gamodu Rav Tobiad Yiches Kelin Koim Kemrimaru Rei Menachechide Migo Yamaru Rei Adoinoi Kitzarli Meyai Chomar Boru Hashivenu Sisi Shima Ledoin Sayoni Shiv Tom Remois Chatzeirai Lahad Kieni Sivsei Meshoin Redvir Domem Ladiveni, Shomatos Moinos Afechin Tateini, Shachvu Venodu Chopsot Lavrieni, Shomuki Nenochoni, Kitom Haktom Bechesoi Vanecho, Toshilem Gemul Kos Chazois Ponecho, Tirdoif Litzalmoin Yatse Yaltsunecho, Tite Lahab Heim Noisit Seifeninecho, Tikra le shakram kois kamus befinecho, Tavoicho rosom lefonecho, Tavoyat sarash kilonu, Limvoi chamos becheimon yalonu, Ad lach lechovoi riglonu, Zokenu vachunu suda kvalonu, Roma ben Noam Chokulo Nuzechoy Radoy Noy Me Oyolo. Ibn Magid used to give a mashal. I say this mashal every year, making apologies for repeating it, because it's incredibly powerful, and it really captures, as only the Ibn Magid could, what is really going on in this day. To introduce it is a medrash. Rashi brings it. The Gemara in Kiddushin, the Gemara is talking about the mitzvah of Kibud Av. And it tells a story of one of the Amoraim that was, his father asked him for a drink, and he bent over to give him the drink. And as he bent over to give him the drink, the father fell asleep. And so he stood there and waited dutifully, not moving, in case so that when the father would wake up, the cup of tea or whatever it was would be right there. And whilst bent over like this, focused on the needs of his father, he had the following thought. There is a perek in Tehillim, Mizmor la'asaf Elohim bo goyim benachal osecha, a song for Asaf. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nations have come and they have trampled, they have stepped all over the Beis HaMikdash. And the question is an obvious one. Mizmor la'asaf, is that the right way to introduce this thought, that there are enemies trampling all over, killing in the chotzer of the Beis HaMikdash, killing koyanim, and that's a mizmor, that's a song. Kino la'asaf miboyele, asks the Gemara. Surely that is something we should cry about. And the answer is because there was a choice. It's a well-known idea, but there was a choice. And we'll introduce this choice with the mashal of the Dubna Magid. And he tells the story of a couple who are married for many years, and they're not blessed with children. And they go to doctor after doctor, treatment after treatment, professor after professor. And finally, when the woman is quite advanced in age, finally, there's a massive simcha. She's finally pregnant. And they wait and wait with bated breath. 9 months later, she goes into hospital, ready to have the baby. In the middle of the birth, of the labor, the doctor comes out to speak to the husband who's waiting nervously outside, and the doctor has a very worried look on his face. And he says, I'm really sorry to tell you, but there is a very big complication in the birth. Something has gone not as it should, and there is a big problem, and we only are able to save either your wife or the baby. Obviously, just as a caveat, of course, this is not meant to be taken in any way as a halachic solution, but for the purposes of the mashal, of the story. So the husband is faced with this impossible choice. So he goes in to see his wife, who is struggling for her life, but she's conscious and she knows what's going on. And she says, without hesitation, she says to her husband, she says, my dear husband, El Hanar Hazeh Hispaloti. This is what we've been waiting for and praying for all these years. And finally, we're going to have Zera Anoshim, we will have a child. This is the culmination of all of our dreams and hopes. And I'm older anyway. And if it's a question of who it should be, please, I will give up my life so that the child should live. And you can imagine, can't imagine the scene, the tears, the heartache, but very sadly and very reluctantly, the husband takes his farewell from his wife. He says goodbye to her and then leaves the room, and the doctors do what they can. And a short while later, the doctor comes out holding a little crying bundle of life, and he says to the husband, Mazel Tov, Baruch Dein Emes. In the same breath. You have a beautiful, healthy baby boy. Now the husband has to sit Shiva for his wife. And then after Shiva, he gets up. One day to 7 days of Shiva, and then 1 day later is the bris for the boy. And as the boy grows up, and as he gets older, and he sees that all his classmates have birthday parties, and they go on fun trips, and they have great cakes and presents, and every year on his birthday, somehow his father, he buys him a nice cake, he buys him a present, but his father's always sad. And as he gets a bit older, he asks his father, what's going on? This is my birthday, why are you not happy? And his father said, well, it's your birthday and I'm very, very happy, but I just wish your mother would be here with me to share the joy of your birthday. Today, because you see, today is her yahrzeit, it's your birthday, but it is, of course, also her yahrzeit. Eventually, he becomes bar mitzvah, and this is the day he's been waiting for. And everybody, all his family and friends come round, and there's a party, and you can imagine how emotional it is. And his father gets up to give a drosha. It's also the yahrzeit of his wife, it's the bar mitzvah. And he gives a very beautiful and moving drosha. And everybody's moved to tears, and the bar mitzvah boy gets up and he bangs on the table and he says, enough! I've suffered my whole life already with this mother person who I never met, and she has to spoil my bar mitzvah as well. Everybody is shocked and open-mouthed at this selfish brat. How can he speak that way? And his father says to him, how can you speak that way? If it wasn't for her sacrifice, you literally wouldn't exist. And the son says, what some of us perhaps are thinking, says the Maggid. The son says, it's all very well for you. You say the name of my mother and you can picture a living, breathing person. You have memories, you knew her, you lived her, you went through difficulties, the friends knew her. They say her name and they can picture her and they can remember her smile and they can remember what she said and what she was like, and it's real to them. And then therefore on this day, it's her yahrzeit, there is this sadness as well. But I never met her. I know in my head that I owe her my life. I'm finding it really hard to connect to that because I never saw her, I never met her. And that, says the Maggid, that really is the challenge that all of us face today. How do we squeeze out a few genuine tears for something that we never experienced? We're so far removed. How do we do that? That is really the big question. And it can be compounded. Perhaps we can go to Eretz Israel, we can see entire neighborhoods, beautiful neighborhoods. And we see some of the Nevuah coming true already. Oid Yeshvu, Zakenim, Zakenos, that the elderly and the young will sit in neighborhoods in Yerushalayim or HaKodesh. You can feel a Shabbos, you can live a Shabbos, you can hear a Shabbos from all the neighbors. Is there anything more beautiful than a Shabbos in Yerushalayim? Still to be able to cry that this is nothing compared to what it should be. Boine Yerushalayim, Nachem Tzienu, Boine Yerushalayim. This is a real challenge. We were never at the Beis HaMikdash. We can only read accounts and think about what it must have been like, the glory, the nissim, the majesty, the dignity, the gold, the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, the song, the orchestra. And we knew there was a Ribbono Shel Olam. We lived it, we breathed it. There was no such thing. There was no reform, it couldn't be. It was obvious. Everybody knew. Of course, there was a Borei Olam. Asara Nissim. And I think what we can do is talk about the things that we do know, the things that we know are not right in our own lives, and know that in some way they are connected. They're connected to what we should be having. We think about what it must have been like to walk up. Imagine you lived somewhere in the middle of Eretz Yisrael, and it came a week before Yom Tov, and everybody left their house unguarded. Every male over the age of 13 walked to Yerushalayim. And that's another miracle. Nobody ever, the Palestinians or whoever, they didn't realize that all the border towns are empty. They weren't stupid. Nobody ever attacked. That was part of the Haftarah. Imagine hundreds of thousands streaming through the streets, singing as they go, with their money, ready to go and buy korbanos, and staying in Yerushalayim for Pesach, for Shavuos, and for Sukkot. That beauty that has gone, and today Yoshva Bodod. That means even the Yerushalayim of today is still relative to that is Yoshva Bodod. It sits alone and mournful and desolate. And the theme that we need to really speak about, because that is the one that is identified by Chazal as being the main cause for the Churban Bayis Sheni, is of course Sinas Chinom. What does that mean? And how do we try in some way to push back against it? And one of the things that I personally always find powerful before we even get to a more detailed understanding of it is really understanding and seeing how our Gedolim, how they treated other Jews. The story here I'd like to read. In Eretz Yisrael in the early 1900s, there were two hospitals mainly two hospitals available to the residents of Yerushalayim. One was Shaarei Tzedek, which was run by religious Jews, and the other one was a hospital run by missionaries. At that time, there were many in the non-religious camp who didn't really like the Rav of Yerushalayim, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who stood up to those that wanted to move against Yiddishkeit. And he spoke his mind. He would speak his mind. It happened that one of these anti-religious Jewish leaders became very ill. He spent 2 weeks in the missionary hospital, and then his health took a turn for the worse, and the doctor said there's nothing more we can do for him. Maybe in Shaarei Tzedek they can do something for him. So the family went to Shaarei Tzedek, and as soon as they heard that the person that they wanted to admit to the hospital was one of the main people who would insult and regularly attack Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, they didn't want to accept him into the hospital. And then a relative realized that the only way they would get the hospital administrator to change his mind is by going directly to Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. And he writes the following account, which he preserved in a diary, which we have. He says, I rushed to Rabbi Yosef Chaim's house in the rain. By the time I arrived, I was soaked to the bone. When I entered his room, he was giving a shiur. He was leaning over a large Gemara. He knew me when I was younger because I used to go to Cheder before I decided to become not religious. And I knew he was sad at the way that, because I had left the ways of my parents, and nevertheless, he greeted me warmly. He told me to sit down. I said to him, I'm sorry to disturb the Rav, but this is the situation. We have a close family member who is ill. He's been in the other hospital. And he's not getting better. He said, who is it? He asked me who it was. I told him who it was, and I wasn't sure how he was going to respond. Immediately, he bent over the corner, the top page of his Gemara, closed his Gemara, and stood up and put his coat on. So I said to him, Rebbe, it's raining outside. Just give me a message, whatever the message is, and I'll take it to the administrator. When dealing with saving a life, one does not send letters, said Rabbi Yosef Chaim. He ran up the stairs and out into the street. Although he was 75 years old and I was quite young, I could hardly keep up with him. The rain worsened, and I suggested that we should wait in a courtyard for a few minutes until it stopped raining. He shouted at me and he said, if we're saving a life and you're worried about raindrops. We went into the hospital together, and I rushed into the room to hear the words that he said to the administrator. Since when do you decide questions of life and death? He told off the administrator who had refused this person entry into the hospital. Admit him to the hospital immediately, and then we can discuss it. He then turned to me and said, bring him immediately. Tell him to come immediately. Every moment is precious. He was admitted to the hospital, and 2 weeks later, he was released healthy. I was embarrassed, says this relative, to go and explain to the person who was saved afterwards, because he wouldn't believe the way that he was treated by his enemy, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. And this is not an isolated incident. There are many, many such incidents. Stories with Moshe Feinstein, the Satmar Rebbe, and many others, people who opposed them publicly. Somebody who published a sefer against Reb Moshe Feinstein. Imagine publishing a sefer. This is not a story from hundreds of years ago. This is 2-3 decades ago. Somebody who published a sefer against the Godel Ador to show that he is absolutely wrong. And then that person was caught by the authorities for some financial scandal. I don't know exactly what the details were. And he needed a character reference. And they had the chutzpah to ask Reb Moshe Feinstein to give a character reference for this person. And unhesitatingly, Reb Moshe wrote a glowing, personal character reference that this is a good person, he's a kind person, and his Talmidim asked him, but Rebbe, this is the person that is just, you don't have to go out of your way to do anything to harm him, but to write a letter of support for him, a character reference. Rebbe Moshe was absolutely, the right word is perplexed, confused. He said, what's one got to do with the other? He disagrees with me in halacha. Maybe he should have published a sefer against me, maybe he shouldn't. What I'm writing is true. He is a person of good character. Why should I not help him? The challenge, and this is really painful to say, I say it every year, but it has to be said. The Gemara, when the Gemara talks about what was happening at the time of Bayis Sheni, it says not only were they busy learning Torah, but it says something that is really challenging and hard to hear. They were oisek b'Torah u'gemilus hasadim. They busied themselves. They didn't just do it in a casual way, a little bit, temporary. No. When we are oisek b'divrei Torah, that's the bracha we make every morning. It means this is my business. On the ship, taking the Talmidim from Shanghai to Eretz Yisrael, and they asked Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, where are we? You can imagine how excited they were. They'd been in Europe and then in Shanghai, and then finally they were on their way to Eretz Yisrael, and the joy, the elation. And as they were getting closer, somebody asked Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, wo halten wir? Where are we? And without hesitation, Reb Chaim said, Shmaitzer Dalet Perek Gimel. It's a sefer, that's where he was. That's who he was. He was no less excited than anybody else. He would cry his way through Haftarah, Shavuos night. He was a highly emotional person. But Torah was his business. And the Gemara says at the time of Churban Bayis Sheni, they were oisek b'gemilas chasodim. They didn't just do kindness every now and again. It was a business. There were gemachim. There were lots of different types of organizations, and that really begs the big and painful question. How is it possible that at the same time there is a society that is busy with learning Torah, oisek with Talmud Torah, and oisek with Gemilas Chasadim? Organizations, trustees, budgets, workers, for no purpose other than to help other Yidden, and at the same time, sinas chinam can be a hallmark of that society. It can be a defining characteristic, a midah, that there was sinas chinam, not by individuals, but by so many, to the point that this brought about the Churban Abayis. That is one of the biggest and painful questions we have to confront, because if the Beis HaMikdash has not been built yet this year, and it was destroyed for sinas chinam, it means that it is alive and well with all of our yeshivas and schools and kiruv organizations and gemachim, and it should not be in any way diminished. The amount of chesed that Jews do. Go to any city, a Torah city in Eretz Yisrael, or indeed in America, and the bigger the city, the more gemachim there will be to help you free of charge for pretty much anything you need. Your baby wakes up at 2:00 in the morning in Kiryat Sefer and you need penicillin, you'll have it within 20 minutes. Whether or not you should take it without a prescription, that's a different story. You're locked out of your car in Stamford Hill on Friday afternoon, 20 minutes before Shabbos, You left your keys in the car and you locked yourself out. A Hasidic guy will show up on a motorbike within 10 minutes and will open your car for you. Chaveirim. Hatzola. Shoimrim. Gemilas Chesed Shel Emes. There's every imaginable, and these people are angels. There are incredible Yidden all over the world helping other Yidden the whole time. Religious, not religious. It's amazing. We should be so proud, but somehow seems it can happily coexist with a real hatred of another person for nothing. How can that be? What does it even mean? How does it work? What type of hypocrite do we need to be? What? I'm not sure there is a good answer. But we know it's a reality that just because a person is really busy, genuinely trying to help other Yidden, it doesn't mean that he likes other people, or that there aren't people. And we're not just talking about individuals. This is about a society. Sinas Chinam was a hallmark of the society. I don't know whether I should even give answers. I have some thoughts. I think every year I give some slightly different thought, but I think the question is just so powerful. It forces us really to dig inside of ourselves and ask why we do the things that we do, how we do the things that we do. If we don't have that self-awareness and that incredible honesty inside of ourselves about why we do the things we do, it can quite happily sit together with sinas chinam, to hate another Yid for no reason. And it's that word, the word is sinna, it's to hate. It's one thing to say, I don't like everybody, I don't get on with everybody, we're a bit different, everybody's a little bit different. That's fine, but to say, I hate another Jew, it's just so painful, but unfortunately, it's real and it's still with us. Maybe let's go to the next kinna. Say kinna number 9. Eichot Tifarti. Let's see that one. See that one. Short break. Maybe I will just introduce it to the palette. There's one of the supported ones. Then you speak the same. Yeah. Good. Okay. Fine. Okay. Before we move to the next kinnos, the next one we'll do is kinnos Yud Aleph, which is probably, if one can say such a thing, probably the most important kinnos because it was, or it refers at least to the kinnos written by Yirmiyahu or Yeshayahu. I just want to mention a Chasam Sofer in his drashas. I saw something which he writes, which reminded me of a minhag that they have, which I saw in Gibraltar. I don't know whether they do it in other kehillas. Maybe it's a Sephardi thing, I don't know. The Chasam Sofer wrote that this is something that a person should try and keep. He writes as follows, he quotes a Mechilta, that after Yitzias Mitzrayim, the year when we spoke about years, we dated everything from Yitzias Mitzrayim. Had we still had a Beis Hamikdash, we would have dated things from the Binyan Habayis. He says, however, once we have suffered the Churban, then our dates are on the basis of years since the Churban. And the Chasam Sofer goes on to write that he wants to fulfill this din, and he mentions that the year of his drasha was exactly so many years since the Churban. In Gibraltar, they have a minhag that at night, at the end, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me correctly, it's at the end of kinnos. Even though until then there was very little, as is the minhag, very little light in the shul, but then they turn absolutely all the lights off, and there's only one little candle. And they say in Spanish, hoy es 1152 años. Today it's so and so many years since the Churban Beis Hamikdash, but they say it in a particularly mournful tune. I always found it very powerful, very impactful. This is so and so many years since, almost virtually in pitch darkness in front of the Aron HaKodesh. It's so exactly how many years since Churban Beis Hamikdash. Oyna lanu ki chotanu. So maybe it's worthwhile remembering for us, it's 1,952 years since the Churban Habayis. That's how many years. That is our dating system. That's how many years we've been sitting on the floor and crying. 1,000 this year, unfortunately, we're doing it 1,952nd time. That's a long time. That's a lot of tears. That's our history. It brings it, in a way, it makes it real. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes in his Siddur, and I want to read out two small paragraphs because they're very powerful. He says, Mishum Churban Beis Kodshenu V'Tifartenu. He says, if we were as a nation to have no other sin other than she'ein misablin al Yerushalayim koroi, dai bozel ha'arich goluseinu. If everything else was fine and perfect, but if we did not manage, at least in the few hours we have once a year, that we don't cry for the Churban Habayis, that is in and of itself enough reason for the Golus to continue. Very, very powerful words from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. V'hi be'enai hasiba hakroiva b'yoser v'hayoser geluya atzuma v'chazoka l'chol hashmodos hamuflogos anoiros amavilos asher mitzaunu b'gvul Golus b'chol mokim pezureinu. He says, this in my eyes is the reason for all the tzoros and the fact that the Golus endures and it hasn't ended because we're not upset enough. This is very, very strong stuff. Al savarenu nirdafnu lehunach lonu lahargia bagoyim lefi sheyotza ha'evel hazeh milibenu. We find it so hard to really genuinely be sad. Yotza ha'ovel haloz milibenu, because we are shoikim v'shoiktim be'eretz leilanu. We are settled, we're happy. We're settled where we are. Shochachnu es Yerushalayim. We've forgotten Yerushalayim. Ol salavavenu al kein kames mileiv nishkachnu. It's like the dead is forgotten. There is a special gezerah. There's a chesed from Hashem. Nishkachti kames mileiv. Even somebody we love and needed. But after a certain amount of time, the pain subsides. And there's a special chesed from Hashem that you begin to forget so that you're able to get on with your life, but not for Yerushalayim. It's still fresh. Midoyer ledoyer includes Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Noisef yogein al yogeinenu. Mi v'mi hamisabel v'nenach al churban abayis. Who is really upset? He sees in this the reason for the long Golus. I saw a beautiful idea from the Chasam Sofer on the Al Naharos Bovel. We sat on the riverbanks of Bovel. Shom Yoshavnu Gam Bachinu Es Tzion. Says the Chasam Sofer, such a beautiful idea. Shom Yoshavnu. We settled in Bovel. So much so that Ezra couldn't kick us out. He couldn't motivate us to go back to Eretz Yisrael. We married, Nebuch, we married out. Shom Yoshavnu, we settled in Bovel. We made it our home. Says the Chasam Sofer, only he can see something positive in this. Even though Shom Yoshavnu, we settled, we became Babylonians. Gam bochinu b'zachrenu es Tzion. Even as Babylonians, even intermarried, assimilated Babylonians. Gam bochinu b'zachrenu es Tzion. We were still able to cry when we remembered Tzion. For an assimilated Jew who considers himself Babylonian, to be able still to cry is quite something. That is the challenge. We come now to the next. The next kinnos is arguably the most important one. It is Yirmiyah Hanavi being Mekoinen for Yoshia HaMelech. We all know the basic story. Maybe it's worthwhile just quickly repeating it. Yoshia HaMelech was a big tzaddik. His grandfather was a terrible Rasha, Menashe. Menashe institutionalized, he made Klal Yisrael serve Avodah Zarah. He stopped them from going to the Beis HaMikdash. His son, Amoin, was a Rasha. Yoshia HaMelech was 8 years old when he became king. And it seems, and this is not for now, it's probably a subject for an interesting Shia. It seems that the ignorance became so widespread that when they found the Sefer Torah in the Beis HaMikdash, it was a cause for celebration, for astonishment. They began to make repairs to the Beis HaMikdash in his life, and then he started a massive tshuva campaign, a real widespread teshuvah campaign, and people started doing real teshuvah. And they started keeping Torah properly. And he would even make sure, he sent the police to make sure that there was no Avodah Zarah, and he thought that he had got rid of all of the Avodah Zarah. And he was so confident that he had got rid of all of the Avodah Zarah that then when he was approached by Mitzrayim, Egypt, who wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael, he was so confident that all of Klal Yisrael had done teshuvah, and there was no more Avodah Zarah to be held, to be found, that he said no to Paroi. Confident that in any milchama, in any war, he would win, because everybody was religious now, everybody was frum. And Yirmiyah told him, no, I know things that you don't. It might look on the surface as if everybody is frum, but there is still Avodah Zarah. People have Avodah Zarah in their doorposts. Half an Avodah Zarah on one side and half on another. When they closed the door, the whole Avodah Zarah was there. Listen to me. It's not right the nation is not strong enough in Ruchnias spiritually to be able to be confident that you're going to win the war. And he ignored Yirmiyah, even though he was a tremendous tzaddik. And in him, it seems, was the last hope of really holding back the Churban and possibly stopping the Churban. But when he didn't listen, and here there's another lesson in this as well for all of us. Sometimes we think we know better. We have Gedolim, we have greats. But do we really do them if that's the way that they should be? Or do we go with some sort of preconceived idea and see whether we can get them to say what we want them to say? And this is where it went wrong. He ignored Yeshua, ignored Yirmiyah, went to war, and he died a horrible 300 arrows piercing him. And Yirmiyah lamented, Vayikainin Yirmiyah al Yeshayahu. And Yirmiyah lamented him. And that from that moment on, it was sealed that there would have to be the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Say together, Kino Yud Aleph. 11. Vayikainin Yirmiyah al Yeshayahu. Eicha Eli Kainu Beyela. Ben Shmoina Shona Eicha Lidroish Me'eloha. Bnei Chabam Ramchanu V'Ano. V'lo Yuzkano Yisigui Mifalo. Gam B'chol Malchei Yisrael Asher Komu Ligdair. Lo Yikom Kamo Yumi Mois Avidoir. Lo Bagboichet Leitzonei Yadoir. Asher Komu Acharav Denes Listoir. Ha'ich Limzer Rashi Choir. Isma Yatoir Pichamoy Mishoir. Vayigdalo V'Meishiv Yomin Ochoir. V'oid Lo Yisholach Yodoi Min Achoir. Zaku Amoro K'nom Naslokim. Bitzayim Rosoi V'od Nur Asher Lo Yokim. Choshach Torah K'nyatzu L'choikim. B'vetzamoy Yasei Das V'chukim. Toivim Roim Nikreu B'sholchoi Malo. Mali V'lo Chayoim L'saloch. Yidei Amoretz Dobrim B'moloch. Teyonesh B'mitzias B'nei Filo. Ki lo hamoinai L'chesarav Narayim. L'mahad Lo Yisabu B'cherev Kol Shehu B'Efrayim. V'lo Yishom Malach Yizer. V'shuv Achoyrayim Ki Gzeiro Nigzero L'sachsech Mitzrayim B'Mitzroyim. Mechatois Siras Mezuzos Chazoin Anisois Yechelul Vazois No, I'm not in the Mulam Zois. They say, Bono, the soft to Alzois. Suru hey to Adoishia, my Moanu Suru Moti Soinishia. Nay crop Kikorev Leon Solo Ritia. My Yanu Amoy, Namelech Yoishio. Oidenu Oid Semeno, Begep Yoino Chatzim, Chet Zachachet Moidim Lechatzim. Sodu Vesamu Kemator Lachitzim. Vayizruku Vaishloish Meyois Fitzim. Kale Mitu Acharo Vezoin Moit Sofiu. Va'ad Mitsui Nefesh Maso Vefiu. Ruach Soso Vivtso Mipiu. Tzadeku Adoinoi Kimori Sipiu. Sisi Noi Pikinei Zam. Shalem Shioinom Baboin Vitzom. Tam Kesmatoy Vamzu Befoshom. Vayikoy Neinolo. Kole Choyuom. Top Mikre Chokois Migidolishtois. Moich Nasash Mito Kigo Hakele Lesois. Tolo Besri Mushtagi Mearois Shosois. Is Abdullah Yecha Besri Mushtagi Moisiois. Ois kinnos Luboto Mechoidi. Eis Kishochafti Mechoidi. Zamoisi Kilo Ad Yahidi. Roshati Nosati Venutash Holy. Just on the theme of Yoshia not listening to Yirmiyah. Again, I say this story every year, but I'm always astounded by the connection. It was a Talmud of the Chasam Sofer. His name was Reb Leibish Mintz. He was a Talmud Chacham, a big Talmud Chacham. He had smicha from his Rebbe, the Chasam Sofer. And he was appointed as a Rav in a city in Poland. A rumor spread about him, which in those days was not considered, and for where he was, it wasn't considered something good. A rumor spread that he had once, apparently, so the rumor went, he had studied in a non-Jewish school. And in that society at that time, it was not something that they were comfortable with, that their Rav should have been a studierter, somebody who had studied in a non-Jewish school. So some people were unhappy with this and they started distancing themselves from the Rav. There was another dayan in town, and before long, a lot of people would go and ask the dayan the shaylas and not this Rav. And they said, well, this Rav knows, he knows secular stuff, so he can go and deal with the local, the politicians and the local officials. He's good with that sort of thing. But if we want real Torah, we're going to get it from somebody who hasn't been tainted by studying in a non-Jewish school, chas v'shalom. And Reb Leibish tried to ignore it, and he just got on with life. But eventually, machlokas broke out in town, and there was it seems at the time there was some sort of health scare, there was an epidemic, and the authorities had forbidden people to gather together to stop the disease spreading. Where have we heard that before? And there was a A chasna was planned. And but Reb Leibish, the Rav, said he felt that because of the epidemic, because of the plague, they shouldn't go ahead with the chasna, they should postpone the chasna. But these Balabatim thought they knew better, they didn't like the Rav anyway. He's a studierter, he's not a real Rav. So they decided they were going to ignore him. And they decided to have the chasna in the Beis HaKvaros. They thought it would be the last place anybody would go looking for a chasna in the Beis HaKvaros. So they made the chasna in the Beis HaKvaros. The Rav found out about it and he paskened and he told them, he said, anybody who shows up to the chasna will be arrested. He said, made it very clear. So because they had no choice, eventually they canceled, the wedding was canceled, but they were obviously very, very upset with him. That Rosh Hashanah, as they prepared themselves, as the Kehillah prepared themselves for Tkiyah Shofar, the Rav stepped up to the bima to be the Baal Makri, to call out, as was the minhag then. Rav was the Baal Makri. But then one of the outspoken members of the Kehillah got up onto the bima and said, for our tkiyos, he said, we need a Baal Makri who doesn't speak Latin and Greek like you. We need a real Rav, a Talmud Chacham. We don't need you to be our Baal Makri. When we need someone to call out the tkiyos, for a goyish God, we'll call you, but for the Rabbeinu Shalom, we need an Erlich Yid. But he didn't stop there. This Mechutza lifted up his hand and he slapped the Rav across the cheek. A fight broke out in Shul. The police were called. The Rav was escorted home by policemen. And a few days later, he left town. That was it. Game over. A horrible, horrible story. And then the final punchline is the name of the town. The town was Auschwitzien, otherwise known as Auschwitz. I think that speaks for itself. I would like to talk a little bit about a topic which I sort of came across almost by mistake. I have a question which I've asked many Talmidei Chachamim, and I think maybe I have an approach, possibly. The question is as follows. How come in our tefillos, we very, very rarely, almost never daven for Binyan Beis Hamikdash? That's true. We say at the end of Korbanos, Yehi Rotzain, very nice. There's a Yehi Rotzain. That's not Me'ikah HaTfilah. At the end of Shemona Esrei, there's a Yehi Rotzain. On Shabbos, what do we say? Sitainu b'gvuleinu. Plant us in our gevulos, in our borders. The only time we really ask directly is in Musaf of Yom Tov. B'nei beischok vatchila. Build your house. The rest of the time we say B'nei Yerushalayim. How come? How come? So the question bothered me for a while. If it is so central and so important, we are sitting here and crying for the Binyan Beis Hamikdash, how come it isn't virtually anywhere in our tefillos? B'nei Yerushalayim. And more than that, if you actually look at Eicha and the Haftorahs and the kinnos, the Beis Hamikdash as such is almost not there. It crops up a little bit every now and again, but the focus is on one thing only. Do you know what that focus is? Yerushalayim. Eicha Yoshva Bodod Ha'ir Rabosi Om. It's all about Yerushalayim. Look through all the Haftorahs. There's one thing and one thing only that we stress again and again and again. It's Yerushalayim. And the only time, to the best of my knowledge, that we ask directly is in Musaf of Yom Tov. And there's a reason for that, which is technical and halachic, because the rest of Karbanos of Shabbos, Makrivin, Afal Pisha in Bayis, you can bring them up in the Bachutz. You don't need, in fact, they brought up Karbanos after Churban Bayis Rishon, you know that. Karbanos were brought after Churban Bayis Rishon. They had a Mizbeach. You can bring a Karban. You don't need a Beis HaMikdash. There is one, the Netziv, there's a beautiful Netziv in Hamikdava. He says, V'loi oriach v'reach nichoichechem. It says, V'hashimoisies mikdeshechem. Says Hashem, I will destroy the Beis HaMikdash. V'loi oriach v'reach nichoichechem. I will not smell the reach nichoyach of the karbonos, and that means we're not allowed to bring karbonos which require reach nichoyach. And I think perhaps the correct answer or the correct approach to this is actually, time doesn't permit today too much, but to actually begin to think about Yerushalayim. It's actually all about Yerushalayim, because listen to the Lashon of the Rambam. The Rambam says, when he talks about the effect of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash on that place and on Yerushalayim, listen to the Lashon of the Rambam. He says, V'loma ani omer b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim kedusha rishona kidsha la'asid lavai. Why do I say? The Rambam makes a difference between Eretz Yisrael generally and Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. There's two categories. There's the rest of Eretz Yisrael, and there is Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. And he poses a question, he asks himself a question. Why do I say that b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim, the Kedusha remains even if there is no Beis HaMikdash? U'b'Kedusha sha'ar Eretz Yisrael, but when we talk about the Kedusha of the rest of Eretz Yisrael, regarding Shemitah, Trumas, and Maasros, there the Kedusha went away with the Churban Abayis. And he says as follows, the following beautiful words, which I think put it all into context. Lefi shekedushas hamikdash v'Yerushalayim mipnei hashchina u'shchina eina b'teila. Because the Kedusha of the Mikdash and Yerushalayim is because of the Shechina, and Shechina can never be b'teila, it can never be bottled. It can be hidden, we can't access it, but Mikdash and Yerushalayim are in the same breath, and that is Eina b'teila. And that is really what it means. It is all within the context of Yerushalayim. The Beis HaMikdash does not exist in a vacuum. It's not just a Beis HaMikdash somewhere. 3 times in the Torah we use the words Lifnei Hashem, to be Lifnei Hashem. Sometimes it's used in Yerushalayim. You eat Ma'aser in Yerushalayim, Kodoshim Kalim, you can eat in Yerushalayim. It says, V'achal tosham lifnei Hashem Elokecha. When you are in Yerushalayim, you are lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Sometimes it refers just to the Har Habayis. V'chatzotzeros v'kol shofar hariu lifnei hamelech Hashem. We blow chatzotzeros and shofar, says the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, in the Mikdash and in the Har Habayis. That is called lifnei Hashem. And sometimes there is lifnei Hashem. The shochat as ben habokar lifnei Hashem is in the Azorah, in the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. And this is, I think, perhaps not appreciated often enough. The Mishnah says, Eser Kedusha Hein. There are 10 levels of Kedusha. Eretz Yisrael Mekudeshes Mikolo Arotzois. Eretz Yisrael is holier than other lands. Asks the Mishnah, Umahi Kedushasa. What is the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? Now, how would you have answered that question? I would have answered that question by saying, there's Trumas and Maestras and Shemitah and Yovel and all these other mitzvahs that you do in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah does not say that. The Mishnah says, Shemevien mimeno ha'oimer v'habikur imushtei alechem. The Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is that it connects to the Beis Hamikdash. Mevien mimeno the oimer, the bikurim, and the shtei alechem. And then you've got Yerushalayim, Lifnim and Achayma, it's more Kodesh because you eat Kovshim Kalim and Maisa Sheni. What you see, I think, is that, of course, there is an idea that Eretz Yisrael itself is Kodesh, but we need to really see it as all part of one thing. Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash, the Har Habayis and the Beis Hamikdash, they're all part of one thing. The Kedusha of Yerushalayim, the crowning glory of Yerushalayim is the Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't exist in the middle of nowhere. This is what we mean when we say to be Boinei Yerushalayim. And I found a medrash brought from Sefer Tanya, one of the Rishonim. The medrash, Keshebana Shloima es Beis Hamikdash, Poschu Malachei Ashoreis va'omru Baruch Atah Hashem Boinei Yerushalayim. When the Beis Hamikdash was built, what bracha did they say in Shamayim? The Malachim said, "Oh, Boinei Yerushalayim." Now we have Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is it's a progression. There is Eretz Yisrael, and these overlapping circles of Kedusha connect to a Beis Hamikdash. And I think that is why the emphasis in the Haftarahs, in the Eicha, in the Kinnos, which used to bother me, why is it just all about Yerushalayim? What about the Beis Hamikdash? The answer is you cannot have a Beis Hamikdash if you don't have a Yerushalayim. The perfect Yerushalayim is when there is a Beis Hamikdash, and when there isn't, Yerushalayim is bezuya, avela, v'shoymeima, chareva, mibli baneha. In Mincha, we're going to say the bracha of Nachem, and it doesn't mention the Beis Hamikdash. It mentions Yerushalayim only. Nachem, why? Because they are all connected. It's all about Yerushalayim. We need to have a sensitivity to Yerushalayim. The Gemara says, well, I'll finish with this just before we do the next kinah. The Gemara says that the time will come when Mashiach comes. You see, today we're lucky. Today we don't know how lucky we are. Anybody can hop on a plane for a few €100 and you can go to Yerushalayim Eretz Kodesh. The time will come, says the Gemara, when Mashiach comes, not everybody will be let into Yerushalayim. It'll be a privilege. Yerushalayim will turn around and say, do you really get me? Do you really appreciate me? Do you really understand my currency, my value? When you visited me, when I was an Ovel, an Avela, what did you bring me? Did you come and learn and daven? Did you treat me like I should be treated? Because if you didn't, it seems from Chazal that perhaps we won't be allowed in later. Yerushalayim is something to be cherished and to begin for us to see the Beis Hamikdash not as just something disconnected from Eretz Yisrael or from Yerushalayim. It is the crowning glory of what Yerushalayim means. And therefore, when we're davening for Yerushalayim and to be born in Yerushalayim, what it means is we're davening for the Beis Hamikdash. Let's say, kinnos, 1 second, let's see which one we're going to say. List. 21. Arazay Halavonim. Find it. Time is moving on. Arazay Halavonim. Nadirei Atoiro. Ibayreka Yachamle Betara, Damamni Shbach Menosh Sagura, Inam Kidoish, Erukim Alchus Asara, Valela Nibechia Veni Negra, Zois Bezochri Ezak Mora, Hemdas Yisrael, Kediakoidesh Nezem Atara, Tyrele Kidoish, Imeis, Bisachamura. Yadu Goyrom Yirish and Acherem Beruda in Vergoyrom Al Rabban Shimon Poshet Zavore Bocha Knisrog Zaydo Rabban Shimon Chosa Hegmanov Givin Efesh Tsura Vizer Aaron Shabbat in Chaisab Ben Agbido Not Al Roish and Son El Arkubois of Nedo Atoido Some Novaledo Mupi Malpi Babo Gmudo Onovo Marpea Misgaber Batoiro, Pisomnik Nasalov me, some Shmov Hamuda. Sivalavshin Israel, Shoymisaf, Ashira, Sido. Yap, Yoy, Yomru, Lenav, Sheikh Shafi, Benaboido. Rosh Aposhe, Ipace, Yellam came filling with Sasbodo. So I took off, this that's like a bit Sispido. Me'acharav v'vius v'mikim v'geortei chanom v'su b'svoro v'sorkes b'sorei b'masik shel barzel l'ishtabedo yotzetzal nishmos b'yechol v'askoilom ro ashrecho Rabbi Akiva gufav tor b'chol midei toro v'nvovo Rabbi Yehuda achra v'viu b'shiroi leivazoro nerag ben shivim shon no b'idei aruro Yoshev Sani Sohyo Noki V'chosid B'mlachto L'mado Reb Chanina ben Chadio Nachrov Makil Kiloi V'tzion Shoro Yoshev V'doireish V'sefer Torei Imoi V'kifu B'chav L'izmoiro Esoritzisu Bohem V'chrachu B'sefer Torei Smugin Shel Temer Inichwa Liboish L'yom Esmeiro Chosid Rabbi Yesheva Vasoif Alogu Amamoiro Troku B'shtichu Lachobim V'begbudo Yotze Sobaskel Olosh Leiniach L'miteras Muish Telishomero V'acharob Rabbi Chutz Mizbiyo Imemro Oiva Peireya Nisraba Havel Bim Kevametudo Sahadik Rebelozo Ben Shamua Boacharoi no Nenagmar Kilo Yoimer Shabbos Oizman Kiddush Reikat Israel Krocher Rev Shof Wolov Leinichu Bachagim Negomedo Yotzes Onishmo Sebevar Elohim Yotzes Vitzotsudo Kohinu V'chenu Sibum Neablo Lanis Bigodo Biskilo Severek V'chenim Yuchal Sharo No said as we met no yoish no yoisem zudo chazayat from shegatmo tor varie bakfido ye tevadoi no iblo yoisi veliaso ameit vikagim koishlois felek yakim mishia beisodo and tzedek im loich melech im ashol mehem loich loidoi nisa Everybody should be on mute, please. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, could you please, everybody mute themselves? You should not be able to unmute yourself. Why? Thank you. Okay. Time is marching on. We haven't got much time for much more. I'd like to say over something that the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Tzadik Livracha, said after Kol Nidre in the DP camp in 1945. The Kloisenberger Rebbe, who went through the Holocaust and managed not only to give chizuk to others, but then to go on to build, to help people after the war. Famous Sanz, he established the famous Sanz Laniada Hospital and rebuilt his Hasidus. This is what he said in Kol Nidre in the DP camp in 1945. He went to open the Aron HaKodesh after Kol Nidre, and he began to speak to Hashem. And he said, Rabbeinu Shalom, this year, what do you expect us to say? Shamnu, Bogadnu, we've sinned, we have rebelled. Who was there to steal from in Auschwitz? And then the Rebbe then stopped, he caught himself and he said, I am actually a thief. I once returned from the hard day's work and I collapsed on my bunk and my skin got caught between the two boards in the bed. I tried to free myself with a little koyach I had left and the skin tore off my bones and I started bleeding. And as I was bleeding, I moaned, I cried a bit. And when I cried, I woke up the next person next to me. And for this, Gezel Sheina, for this stealing of somebody's sleep, was the only theft that I did in Auschwitz. And for this, I say vidui. And he went through, in this manner, he went through all of the Ashamnu, Bogadnu, Gazalnu in the vidui. He said, Rabbeinu Shalom, we didn't choose to sin. This video was not written for us. He took the machzor and he closed it. Everybody watching him was in shock. And he said, but Rabbeinu Shalom, we are guilty of other sins, other averas that are not mentioned here in the vidui. We sinned in matters of emunah and bitochen in you, Hashem. There were moments when some of us doubted because we would have despaired and we felt hopeless. We recited Shema at night, hoping it would be our last Shema. How many times did we ask you that this should be our last Moed Ani? And when the sun rose and once again we were alive, we were still alive, and we had to say Moed Ani, it was so difficult to say it with any sort of kavanah. And when we had to remove the bodies of our chaverim, were we not sometimes a little bit jealous that they had already met their deaths? These are our Averos. We need to ask you, Hashem, to give us back our ability to be boiteach, to trust in you, even through the long, dark night of Golus, and to remain strong and to remain positive. And that is something that we all need to work on, even as we go through difficult times. Rabbi Shlomo Lau says over the following story about Rebbetzin Tzila Sorotskin, Alei Shalom. She was one of the leading mechanchos of the Beis Yaakov movement. She was a Holocaust survivor, and she said, in all of the 6 years of the war, I cried only once. I was in the most horrible camps. I lost my entire family. I was alone. I had no family, broken in body and spirit. I didn't cry. I returned to my hometown and found a ghost town. Not a living soul remained, and yet I did not cry. I went to lodge where the refugees were gathered. Perhaps she thought she would find somebody there, somebody she knew, a friend or a family. With a last bit of strength, she traveled to lodge in the hope she would find somebody she knew. Walking through the streets, she suddenly heard sounds that she recognized coming from one of the windows. She followed the sounds up to the second floor apartment. And in the darkness, she made out a group of young boys with payers sitting around a table. At the head of the table was an elderly Jew wearing a baseball cap. And they were all saying Aleph Beis to the familiar niggun that she knew from her youth. She began to cry and she fainted. And when she was revived, they asked her, what happened to you? Can we help you? Who are you? Perhaps we can give you something to eat. So she replied, this is the first time I've cried in 6 years. But I'm not crying from pain, I'm crying from joy. I wandered far and wide until I reached Lodz. Finally, I see Poland as it once was. I see it in its original glory. I see Kinderlech, after all the suffering, sitting around a table with an old teacher teaching them Aleph Beis. If we can do that, then no one can defeat us. Let me catch my breath. Let me enjoy this moment. I feel absolutely fine. These are not tears of pain, these are tears of joy. Rabbi Akiva is the one that where everybody else sees bad and sees negativity and despair, he manages to remain positive. How does he manage to do that? Perhaps it lies in Rabbi Akiva's background. Rabbi Nissim Gaon writes that Rabbi Akiva was descended from Sisera, the great enemy of the Jewish people who was defeated by Devorah. There is another girsa. There is another possible text brought in a few places. When the Gemara in Gittin talks about that the grandchildren of Haman learned Torah in Bnei Brak, according to one girsa, this refers to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's very existence, descended either from Sisera or from Haman, is a testimony to good that can come out from a world of darkness. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen says that Rabbi Akiva is the one that can understand the depth of Torah Shebal Peh more than anybody else. Says the Shem Mishmuel, these two ideas are exactly the same. The plan was that we would receive the luchos on Shivas B'Tammuz. And if we would have received them, we would have had everything, all of Torah would have been clear. We would have looked at the luchos and known the whole of Bava Kama and all of the Rishonim and all of the Achronim, everything. There would have been no need to interpret everything. But because of the Egel, that world does not yet exist. We live in a world where we're not always able to see things clearly. But through Torah, and only through Torah, one is able to see the bigger picture. And therefore it's Rabbi Akiva, with where he comes from and his ability to learn Torah to the depths of being able to understand that there is a bigger picture that keeps us able to see, to be positive and to see the future. Let's go to Lamed Aleph, B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim. This really needs another explanation because the night of Tisha Beav is always, the day of Tisha Beav is always the same as the first day of Pesach, and the two are connected, but time doesn't permit now. Az Yoshima Sheshir lo Yinosh B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim Vayekoinen Yirmiyah V'Non Hini B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim Beisi Hiskoinen V'Shachanon B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim Hamas El Shochno Laikan B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim Gale Yom Ram B'Chachoy Mokom B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim Zudunim Shtafo Shatofu V'Roish Yitzafu B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim the God Shamayim Mitsuyazu Bumayim Tzeisi Mitzrayim Lano Brayim my Mamorim Tzeisi Yerushalayim Ashke Bahare Sviloi Sachoy Tzeisi Mitzrayim Koire Yele Belanaris Babel Tzeisi Yerushalayim Umare Kveda Vinegeshi Kherles Levanai Tzeisi Mitzrayim Vecherev Letusha Terach Natusha Tzeisi Yerushalayim Zevachu mincha, Shemin Amishcha B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Sukula Selcha, Ketzaynu Tivcha B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Chagim Shabbosais, Umayvsim V'Yoisais B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Tanis V'Egel V'Evel B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Toivo El Holim Abod Galim B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, V'Lish V'Elu Machnis Arelim B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Yoi Belush Maybe Bishmitamer Shekait of Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Machulatz Mises Lecharus, Kasus B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Kapoires V'Yorayin, V'Avnei Zikorai B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, V'Avnei Akala V'Yabala B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Leviim V'Aroinim V'Shivim Zekein B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Nayaga Nayik Simamainim, Umayishrim Bekainim Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Maishirain Lumarin Yamchem, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Luchanet Madrionus Case of Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Narach Milchama Badoy Neshama Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Rachak Mimen Uwainan Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Sistre Paraiches, Sidre Mareches Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Hey, Moniteches, Malaiseches, Tzeisi Yerushalayim. Oilos Lochi Beisheni Chayim Tzeisi Mitzrayim. The Herem Medukarim Tzeitzinai Karim Tzeisi Yerushalayim. Are big boys, the Chavayim boys with Tzeisi Mitzrayim. Shmikais Usbrais, Kailos Usbrais with Tzeisi Yerushalayim. Sitzazov, am Shterach, am Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Ushlach Hanezov, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Kedusha, Nemuva, Toida, Doinerim, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Nigalom, Meira, Rachatum, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Bina Bishua, V'Chatzetzrei Santu, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Nakas Oinor, V'Nakas Chol, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Shofanu Menai Rabbe Chalelu Toida B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Enel V'Seiva V'Silmat Seiva B'Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Torah usudach le'machamad hachem dom tzeisim mitzrayim sasin v'simcha v'nasu yogim anoch b'shuv b'dim shalayim. Mem Aleph. Sha'ali surufa boish lishloim aviloyich hamisavim shchein b'ratzaz v'layich shoyavim afarer ezakoyim amishtoyim b'malim b'keit lilayich הולכים חשיכים בנגבקים ויוי במשisrach עליהם עלייך ואושרי מנו ישננך וחיבלי נש באותומר בקיינו נלית סירי חבולויך ויסוי נגזן נמובנו יסיין ויקרום מספק מה בגלל לכי חנסונו ויש לכלו תוכה ויש בוסו לא ינכו זוכים בנגח עלייך אדון הדין אותי שויך נמרי ואשקי בני ברוך אלוהי גיסו חרולייך תשמרים גם עוד לשפוט נייל בכל המשפטים מסביב בפלילייך אוי תגזל ישראל דעש איש בחוקים וכן השפריש ישלם לא כמולייך צופרים לפיד ויש הלווה עבור זה נסונך כי באחריסייך לית איש בשולייך סיני על כן בכל בוחלים מואס בגדולים זורח בגמולייך ויש למוי פסדס קיציסמה ידסים מקרוידו אינם שואל משולייך Moshe lemelech, Hashem bocho, lemishtei benoi, tzofa sheigvalke, inat chemilayich, stachas miotir titkas, sinai lemusheich besak, taute lemushal monus, tachlim smolayich, oibit mois adech, anachal, egrikim in shnei sore, yatzilayich, mishran beiror, veshala yesh toish bechadosh, venisrufu gvilayich, choide shlish yuksharvi, Hashlis kendos evol yaifi kelilo isayich Yod alelufai sochino bevalt se bestos azet ashnum kfilayi Esma lenafshi yechye dam chikiekoi ochoil Reirois yashos ushalayi Chodekru chayve kelidachas Sofu shlalim yoinas shitimas lovoi kolayi Lo yedolim sedas lulachio yoabei lois Nesiv yoishem esayil mesilayi Yubda b'vi midvash, limsoich b'mashkid mois, u'liragla yisdom b'layich. Yerav l'inay sheimei magmo ha'yadoich, u'l'l'chol mavsin b'chlam b'layich. Af yechrem v'yechem v'brintom al-cho yaya b'kinichnu rachmai, l'doin b'layich. Lo katzer gaz b'oi, olavdech l'meloch, yishmah l'nosit zolayich. V'ani keshochel b'gamdu nishati, l'vad mehem, l'gizem b'reish, ha'migid migdei layich. ויש מלכים סוי מסורי סליקינית גו חבלי תופים חלילייך אל בשוויס כסבסה כלימוד יד פרועה צוקי חלים ויוד נפשו ישחלולייך יסמוד על מוירה יוי משיסרח חלקוין אבל ישכיני בלייך זקים כמלך צור על שמרוינך ועל כל יכלו יזכויר אבס כלולך יחיל גושי סקלי החבורו שיוצא לך לסובזס לולייך ימנו סייך Inachamech zum Yoshushus Shivte Yishurim Yom Shvalayich Oye Tadi Vadishoni Taiftikhi Telchim Emochem Salim Imchaylaich Yom Removi Beisurech Lo Erloch Yagil Choshech V'yahu Yoyi Duafei Loyi I think we'll say as our final kinna before Elitzion, we'll say the kinna for the Holocaust composed by Reb Shimon Schwab. If you have it on the art scroll, it's on page 386. People have the art scroll? Yeah? No? No? You don't have it? You have it. Through page, if you have it, page 386. We'll say it together and then Elitzion. Hazoicher maskirov doisho ve'eh sashos b'chartot nu yiskei deroyin shaderachroin oyom oyolonu shtufei mabuldav sheposnavshu yisom kol shkuyim ke'abocho yivkidei melivatzi sachayim adeadzi from librocho suelov kapayim ahoy shomayim oyal mektav shivta Yisrael Hey, dois suki, dois sorry, dois chamurois, musois, Kol Moyadayim, Yitain Balgimayim, Tiradrinayim, Melashtois, Nachale Admois, Ale Alfe Alofim, Gufoim Nisrofim, Kamayesh Hachulbon Lazvois. Well, sorry, Atoira, Maxike Mosoy, do Abrich Agnatzidin, Malchishim Midrosh, is Moidim, Moidim, the case with Rabon, Yakirim. Albona is by Traces of it, so is on that road, the top of Shiolu. We got the Rabbi Simon, no, Bechaye, Bechayim, Mois of Lloyd, the Frodu. As dog of Droish, Kisses Rosh, and come to the Leonim, Matrufim. Come after space, we may Sheve, Moshe, Shisha, Alfe, Pobi, Malofim. Shlishi, Oliboy, Bibrakazam, Soye. Bikar me'achem bedo'avto, goyei l'adom, no zichitzar, no maltim chemisei fekosovto. Zchoi l'adokais, tashtokais, oh, nivalu no retzach, yirein be'yim dimesh pnei b'sishkach, no l'netzach. Kol chilu gdicho, vitzricho, mishtoi l'akis aklovim. Zechais by the constraint of this Kai by Nalubi. Bachno is a proi, came to go back in the Moshe and good boys. Professor Troy, Klimas of Noy, Pizzakos, and boys. Rabbi, it's Simon, she got it's over in Hishlan Shali, Litoya. All that is hollow, because Yochidu go, Holidon, the Hop, Minishkoya. Simroi Sasha, Bekitor became shot, Tilly, Matsomois Gidim, the Hadre Horal, Shogis Migal, the Knokim, Toito, Hoidi, Sikhoi Guvois, Yes, Guvois, Dalibrat Mastoyati. Ik gaf goed een VM, Libris, Gelbeien, de virus, en maybe Irish, the Kish, the Anoshim. Prince assets, Moshe Prize, the Shibut Perach, the Mobus Moin. The Eich, Yori Rias, and Fabria Moira is Missouri Hidden Cameron means of Shoil. Eichidu Achik say, Subnai say, no. Koisa is Tare Lomine Roif, we must not be. If they ask me, give me some story. Tibia Dilati, Mavotishmat, Kimori, Tommy Loilo. Daphne Agoilo, Ariel, Nicolas, Asidejo. Toy Kadoshi, Bibna, Shisham, Tigre, Mukhneho, you can't shishmeho. Koshma Yisrael, most Nafshe, the first place we have sway, but the Macharoin. At Stikritz, Dikudim, Rapanima, Minonum, Shoru, Shiras, Mitochoin. Overhead, Nisharab, Kiosimidom, Nikmarim, Nishtateya. Veloy Matsei, Sefer, Limkois, Ivovois, Leibom, Roiseya. Raknische Hadom, as Koroisom, Toisim, Lich, Shecheya. Bahore, Efreaki, Dosom, Mois, Dishnim is Beya. Me and Malay and Sari, Israel, as you done to became the Treffers. Sheiris Abei, Kimat Mizei, Kimosayim, Nichbefes. Eil Chai, Merachim Adoso, Nachim Asher Lechom, Yoit Nichsefes. Oil Chodosh, Tazviyach, Karnei Hoi Tatzmiach, Meru, Vach Elohim, Merachefes. Elitzia in Beyarecha, Ma'isha B'tzidea, B'tzir Sikra, Adukasa, Arba Ne'yulecha. They are going to share. I know they are. Say, hey, she's a mother. They are boy, baby,